Thank you very much, Jason. You've stolen all of my puns. Morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many working people in the room. I wonder if we'll all be here again at the end of the current Parliament. Breakfast was the treat. I have the trick. The Chancellor said, invest, invest, invest. All I heard was tax, 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 spend, spend, spend. I don't know about you, but I am not buying it. I think the worst part, it's in the table at the bottom on the slide, was the sluggish growth forecast for the next 6 years. Growth forecast to decline over that period. Now, I've been looking at some data from 1997 when Mr. Blair came into power. The average from that date to today was 2%, so that's not particularly ambitious. Having further loosened fiscal rules, more capital spending, another 140 billion more over the course of the Parliament. That's Exhibit B on the slide. And all of this tells me that inflation and interest rates will rise in the long term. Threshold cut to employer NI, 6.7% increase in minimum wages. Surely that's going to hurt employment and jobs. And that was noted in the budget document itself when it talked about participation declining by 0.1%. Exhibit C, that means more tax. That's simply thousands more people out of the workforce, a workforce that hasn't returned properly post-COVID. So I'm not sure how all of this works for working people who are already behind on productivity. It's been quite an extraordinary run-up to the budget, as Jason has alluded to. Look at the boss's approval ratings. What I'm going to try and do is cut through all of that. I'm going to get to reported facts, to data, and first principles. So strap in. I'm going to try and cover off where we've been, where we are, and where I think we are going. Every single year we meet up, twice this year, and every year I suggest you keep your eye on one thing and one thing only. That is how much money government is spending, because government expenditure is the true tax. This is because every single budget is balanced. There's no such thing as an unbalanced budget. The reason they always balance is because you and I pay for it. If you're not paying in terms of taxes, which is shown in blue, then you are paying in the form of interest on the borrowing needed to plug the deficit, which is shown in yellow. That borrowing leads to more debt for your children to inherit. So the one thing you have to keep in mind and keep your eye on is that red bar, what the government actually spends. And the real challenge is moving government spending down as a proportion of GDP, a proportion of the country's overall income. If you can do that, you can stop worrying about the stuff on the left. Yesterday, Rachel Reeves told us that expenditure would be maintained at a record, if you take out the financial crisis and COVID, 45% of GDP for a forecast period of pitifully low growth. This is to be financed by £40 billion of tax rises. So what I'm going to talk about is public expenditure, taxes, borrowing and inflation. But before we dive in, and on the hot topic of black holes, I want to consider a brief history of time. So, we're experiencing Labour's first stint back in power since 1997. I'm using 1997 as my starting point. I want you to imagine something for me. Things Can Only Get Better by Dee Ream is playing on the radio. And the best economic measure of when things feel better is when GDP per capita, income per head, is increasing. And that's what this chart shows here. Cast your mind back to 1997. The economy was on an upward trajectory. It started after the early 90s recession. Inflation had lost its sting, unemployment was low, the City of London was rapidly becoming the world's financial centre, debt was a very reasonable 35% of GDP. For one brief year, 2007, GDP per head was higher here than the United States. Look at how that graph moves. Today, the difference is £25,000 per head. To be fair, New Labour had presented itself as stepping aside and confining its role solely to refereeing the markets. Markets were given clarity. Instead of the state trying to engineer growth like we had yesterday, it was left to private enterprise. Now, before he sold off all of our gold, Gordon Brown pronounced 2 fiscal rules to great fanfare at the time. These were to allay market fears in 1997 that he would play fast and loose as a Labour Chancellor. Firstly, public debt shouldn't exceed 40% of GDP. And secondly, the Treasury would only borrow to invest. That was what Brown called his golden rule. Now, it's quite interesting. Yesterday, Rachel Reeves tried to emulate that approach with her investment rule, but borrowing to invest versus only doing capital expenditure, only counting debt when it's capital expenditure, is two different things. Anyway, back to 1997, New Labour duly spent all of the money sloshing around on the public sector. We saw NHS waiting lists come down, schools got more money, growth was high and stable, inflation was low and stable. But there was always an unanswered question, and that was what would happen if the money ran out. And in due course, you can see it on the slide there, 2008, the financial crisis, the economy came to a staggering halt, and the strategy that New Labour had of relying on receipts from financial services, the City of London, and spending on the public sector was caught a little bit with its trousers down. I think Gordon Brown ran out of both energy and Nokia 3210 phones to throw at staffers, and the government duly changed. And you might remember this note from the time, which was Liam Byrne's "We've run out of money" note in 2010. Osborne and Cameron came in, tried to steady the ship, but then we had the Brexit vote in 2016, and fairly sclerotic politicians and civil servants faffed about for 5 years before any kind of deal was put in place. Meanwhile, the population had grown and aged, and public services started to creak, so-called austerity. Then, 2020, we had the government's mishandling of COVID, and I think I can say that because that was acknowledged by the Chancellor yesterday with the appointment of a COVID inefficiency commissioner. So the question I was asking, why did things go so right until 2008, and why have they gone so wrong since? And in my view, there seems to be three underlying tailwinds that drove the pre-2008 economy. Firstly, demographics. So that was a time where post-war baby boomers, their births peaked in around 1964. They were educated to a high and disciplined standard. They were coming of age and in their most productive working years in the 90s and the 2000s. And you remember Tony Blair allowed EU migration from May 2004. So you had a young workforce of people coming into the country who were keen to work. Secondly, globalization began with a vengeance after the fall of the Berlin Wall. China joined the WTO in 2001, and by some estimates, that doubled the global workforce. Finally, Europe, and actually a delayed benefit of joining what was then the Common Market in 1973 was the pressure on underperforming UK industries to up their game thanks to the internal competition in that market. However, those same tailwinds seem to have turned into headwinds following the crisis. And as well as this, I believe there are two basic elements in the successes pre-2008. The first was around workers producing more, and the second was around labour resources rising. And what you see in that data is that productivity fell quite substantially after 2008. And the figures since then have shown a rather sharp deceleration in the growth of output per worker. Something else here. Something material has happened since 1997 and since COVID. This slide illustrates that rather starkly. And history suggests, I don't think we should hold our breaths for public sector efficiencies, which Rachel Reeves heralded yesterday as a 2% efficiency drive for each government department. Because the data historically shows us that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown got this efficiency through the private sector. Understanding this thing around productivity has become a favourite pastime of economists. This is the so-called productivity puzzle. I believe it's more a case of headwinds becoming what tailwinds were before. If you think about it, baby boomers are now retiring in large numbers, and that's putting a related pressure on state benefits. Globalization is turning or has turned into slowbalization with US-China trade wars and post-pandemic reshoring, given all the supply chain issues we had during that time. And finally, Brexit was bodged. The vote was in 2016, but it didn't take any kind of effect until 2021. And I don't think the benefits have been exploited as they perhaps could have been. And if you throw into that mix policy choices made on things like net zero, response to COVID, the situation in Ukraine, you end up with the current position on debt. The way I see it is that over recent decades, Britain has basically tried to provide European-style public services financed by American-style taxes. But we don't have a sovereign wealth fund like the Norwegians do, and we don't have a large, resilient enterprise economy like the Americans do. Britain hasn't prepared for an aging population, the rise in debt, the unpromising outlook for growth and interest rates. It's all contributed to us feeling a little like an increasingly poor country, and it feels that we're now taxing ourselves into further poverty. But as I say, budgets always balance, and ultimately we pay. And I think we had a slight clue yesterday as to how we are paying. But anyway, back to public expenditure, taxes, borrowing, and inflation. I will start with public expenditure. So what we have here, the blue line is public expenditure, the yellow line is public receipts, both since 1948, both shown as a proportion of GDP. Blue line over yellow line is bad. You can note the gentle upward trend in this chart, and you can note the spikes for 2008 and around COVID. Now, what we see is that some 90% of receipts comes from tax. A third, or just over a third of that, from the big three taxes, and the rest is comprised of returns on public corporations and overseas assets. How does that expenditure get split out? Well, it's over different government departments. If I look at the factual ONS data for 23-24, you had 21.7% spent on health and social care, 14.6% on welfare, and interestingly, 6.9% on education and 2.7% on defence, which is substantially less than what was spent on debt interest. Now, call me old-fashioned, but the real black hole here in my mind is the difference between what you receive and what you spend, and that was 122 billion last year, which is about £4,000 per household. What I did yesterday was to plot on this chart the forward-looking OBR numbers. And like any forecasts, we can take these with a little pinch of salt because they'll either be lucky or wrong. But what you can see here is the impact of a 40 billion tax and spend, and the impact on of the investment rule to allow more off-balance sheet borrowing. It's also interesting to note how smooth these curves are, with the volatility from previous years smoothed out. What that leads to at the end of the forecast period, 2029-2030, the deficit becomes 70 billion. Expenditure throughout that period sits as a proportion of GDP at around 45% for the entirety of the period. So that's not coming down, and the main reason for that appears to be down to those sluggish growth forecasts. So no doubt Reeves is hoping to beat those. Very quickly, I was interested in looking at this. Ahead of the budget, I reviewed the OBR's long-term outlook. This is a September 22 document, and it set out what the policies at the time would mean for expenditure in 50 years' time. And you can see 50 years' time, it would have led to 48% of GDP. I wanted to give some credit to the Institute for Fiscal Studies on this because they called this out ahead of the election, and they called out the fact that none of the major parties were disclosing what we all knew, and they called it a conspiracy of silence. To be fair, the silence was addressed yesterday, and for anyone interested in the OBR's breakdown, you can see it on that slide. I don't have time to look at it now. Let's talk quickly about taxes. Now, thankfully, my partners are here, and they will be getting into the detail of taxes. I just want to make one remark pertinent to the budget by quoting the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Beardsley Ruml, and this is what he said. Given control of a central banking system and an inconvertible currency, so something not backed by gold, a sovereign national government is finally free of money worries and needs to no longer levy taxes for the purpose of providing itself with revenue. All taxation should therefore be regarded from the point of view of social and economic consequences. What he basically explained was that there is only two reasons to have taxes. The first is to combat rises in prices by withholding dollars from people's pockets, and the second to redistribute wealth from one class of citizen to another. I've often thought, if the Bank of England can print money, why do we need taxes at all? The answer is the money illusion, which Maynard Keynes wrote about. Most of us will know that £100 does not buy you today what it bought you 10 years ago, but we all still think in terms of past prices. That is the illusion. So we need to realise that money in modern terms, has nominal value but not intrinsic value. It relies on this illusion and it relies on the law to function. But the more that you debase it, the more you print money for nothing, the less likely that illusion is to hold. So that's why we still have taxes. Where you have a fiat currency like we have, taxes are really little more than a tool of control by government and a mechanism, in my mind, to frustrate the free market. What we saw on taxes yesterday was that as a proportion of GDP, they're heading to an all-time high, 38.3% in 27-28. Let's face it, that's why so many of us are here today, because taxes are going to impact our decisions at a transactional level and the timing of those decisions. They are directly interfering with what would otherwise be free market exchanges entered into on an arm's length basis. Now, I bang on about this every year, and I make no apologies for doing so. Debt is sitting around £2.5 trillion. I always have to write the zeros out just to make sure I've got it right. Remember what I said, by the start of the 2000s, debt was less than 30% of GDP, close to the lowest in living memory. So since then, it's risen by almost 70 percentage points. We owe as much as we earn in GDP terms. Definitions matter. So this is net debt. Much was made about that yesterday. I haven't updated this for yesterday's forecasts, but what this does show up to September is excluding liquid assets that the government owns, which is actually relatively small for the UK, about 10%. The financial crisis and COVID, yes, but there's also deeper structural reasons and vulnerabilities for this debt. Preparation for the future, what I said about the time bomb of aging population, that's had a huge impact on debt. We assume lenders will lend to sovereign states at a decent rate because sovereign states have the ability to tax, but that's not always so. Liz Truss found that out, and perhaps less so if the state is already taxing until the pips squeak. The right percentage of debt as GDP is something that's hotly disputed, but an increasing trajectory, in my mind, cannot be a good thing. I think it was interesting yesterday, what you find is governments prioritise short-term giveaways over long-term development and stability. So we see these clever accounting tricks, fiscal illusions, I like to call them. So the one we had yesterday was keeping the debt off the balance sheet, 50 billion quid. PFI was Tony Blair's trick. So you always see that, and that's in the detail of what was pronounced yesterday. Finally, I'm just going to talk quickly about inflation and a bit of fun. So what we have here is the official chart based on CPI. That's saying September inflation 1.7%. Personally, I don't particularly trust the official figures. It always makes me laugh that when it comes to inflation, we report the lower CPI. When it comes to putting up duty on your bottle of whiskey, it works in terms of RPI. But there you go, that's what the official numbers say. And on the right there's quite a helpful ready reckoner. So this is on the Bank of England website. And so back when Tony Blair came to power, what this website is telling me, based on CPI, is that something that cost me £10 then would cost me £19.15 today. Now, as we know, governments can spend because they can borrow. And I was looking at some data on this just yesterday. So I was looking at the US debt levels, which are currently at a staggering $36 trillion. And for a bit of fun, what I did was to plot that increasing debt in the US over the last year alongside the price of gold. And guess what? They correlate almost perfectly. So that's something I always talk about, which really all money is gold and the rest is credit. And so it's quite interesting, as the government is debasing currency with debt, gold is moving upwards accordingly. So that got me thinking, what if money was as sound as gold? So I looked at the gold price from Tony Blair's election, about 200 quid per pound, and what it is today, about £2,000 per pound. And what that allowed me to do is to see that my goods costing me £19.15 today would have cost me £2.05 in 1997 had I been able to use gold to buy them. Perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, this is a more honest measure of real inflation and the hidden cost of public expenditure. I shall leave you with that thought. I'm now very much out of time, so I will sum up with a very personal view of what you are actually able to do, and that's on the slide. Now, as you all know, there is no such thing as a free lunch or a free breakfast for that matter. So I do look forward to sucking up as many insights as I can from you later this morning, vampire-like. So please do find me afterwards. I'll be very happy to talk through anything and explore any of the ideas I've shared with you this morning in more detail.